With Augusta's release being soon, I had a thought. Electro currently really is not that powerful of an element, and honestly, it hasn't been in quite a long time. For most of the game's lifespan, Electro hasn't really had a big heavy hitter character, but I suspect that Augusta will change that. So let's talk about the history of Electro during the lifespan of Wuthering Waves. Starting with the game's release and the 1.0 Electrocast. And I'm gonna be completely honest here, the 1.0 Electrocast had a very big leg up over the other elements because it had two 5-star characters, something no other element was able to say. However, even with this golden opportunity, it somehow managed to squander it. Our 3 Electro characters on release were Kolcharo, Yinlin, and Yuanwu. Yinlin did take 2 extra weeks to come out, but I'll still talk about her for the sake of discussion. But first, let's talk about Kolcharo. Kolcharo was a character that a lot of people, including me, thought was very good at the launch of Wuthering Waves, simply because we had not tasted real power yet. A lot of people glazed Kolcharo because he was so awesome and so cool, so a lot of people simply re-rolled to get him from the beginner banner, and even if they didn't re-roll, they chose to get him from the free selector or the choice beginner banner, so a very large amount of accounts ended up actually having Kolcharo on them. It also doesn't help that during beta, Kolcharo was an incredibly powerful character because swap cancels did not get rid of Ultra Skill effects at the time, meaning that the Kolcharo-Yinlin quick swap duo was one of the most dominant teams during beta. Kolcharo was also nerfed between beta and the game's release, so a lot of the things that people had seen from Kolcharo during the game's beta simply ended up being incorrect compared to the in-game version of Kolcharo. So while people believed Kolcharo was a powerful character, in reality, he ended up having a lot of quality of life issues and clunk to him. It doesn't help that liberation damage dealers at release were stuck with Gen Shin, who as we now all know, is not that good of a character. So the second that we got into the actual hard stages of endgame, and the second people started building up their GNs and their Havoc Rovers and their Encores, people kinda started to realize that Kolcharo wasn't really that good of a character. Yuanwu was always seen as a bad character though, nothing really changed there. He just has an utterly useless kit that you're kinda just not using for anything. And then we got the release of Yinlin. Now Yinlin is a character who was glazed a ton when she came out, which in my opinion was not for good reason. Sure, on her release, she was an incredibly powerful character because she just did so much damage at the time. Remember that at the time, GN was the absolute peak of damage output, and people very much still believed Kolcharo was a good character, and a lot of characters simply didn't have very good buffers, which meant that Yinlin's kit, which just kinda did a lot of damage, ended up being a very good fit for all of the DPSs who did not yet have a good support. If you were playing someone like Chixia, for example, your best buffer was Taucha, who we all know is not very good as a unit. Even during 1.0, we all acknowledged that Taucha was not good, so you'd rather have the personal damage of a Yinlin in that composition. Yinlin also ended up being played a lot with Kolcharo. Her Ultra skill was perfect for Kolcharo, but because of Kolcharo's inherent clunk, most people ended up just running the two as a quick swap duo. Yinlin's role as simply being a damage-based sub-DPS who didn't really have much utility to her name for most DPS characters meant that in that role she would always have a short lifespan. She was the best liberation buffer because the competition was Gen Shin, but the only real liberation DPS we had was Kolcharo, and even he couldn't properly use the Ultra skill because, as I said earlier, most people ended up just playing the two as a quick swap duo, because Kolcharo as a hypercarry is about as consistent as Brant trying to land his anchor. Yinlin did end up getting a pretty good teammate in the form of Jinshi, because Jinshi was the best DPS when she came out, and Jinshi also wanted coordinated attacks, which Yinlin was the best source of due to her high personal damage. However, this role would not last long, because Jeju would come out one patch later, who actually had a better Ultra skill to use with Jinshi, meaning that while Yinlin was still a good character to run with Jinshi, she was no longer the best in slot. She also ended up being used in hypercarry Xiangli teams quite a bunch, but even then, Xiangli hypercarry was not really that powerful of a team, and Xiangli ended up finding her use case more so within the quick swap domain rather than being played as a hypercarry. So ultimately, Yinlin's teams were incredibly limited, and the ones she did have were very much prone to just getting stolen from her. But all of this changed when Xiangli Yao came out. Xiangli Yao is a character that everyone who was playing at the time managed to get, or at least almost everyone, because he was literally given for free from an event. And a lot of people really honed in on the fact that this character was free. Xiangli Yao is an amazing free DPS. Xiangli Yao is so good despite being free. So many people focused on Xiangli Yao being free without critically looking at her performance, because most people ran one of two teams, either the hypercarry team with Yinlin or the quickswap team with Xiangli. But something noticeable in both of these teams is that Yinlin and Xiangli are both characters that have very high personal damage, meaning that Xiangli Yao was kind of being carried on the coattails of two characters who did a lot more damage output compared to the regular support characters. Which is a pretty long way to say that Xiangli Yao's personal damage was not all that. When comparing his personal damage per rotation, he was already losing to other limited characters, those being Jian and Jinshi. Both of them have higher personal damage, and Xiangli Yao was behind by a pretty large margin. However, like I said, he had the very nice advantage of running characters who had very high personal damage of their own, meaning that Xiangli Yao's damage output was split a lot more throughout the rotation instead of just being all hard focused on his own field time, which brought its own benefits. But the inherent limitation of having lower personal damage, even when you run him with his best in slot support, meant that Xiangli Yao had very little room to grow, because his damage floor was simply lower than that of other characters. The only way to buff Xiangli Yao more would be to give him a 5-star sub-DPS character who had both a perfect outro skill as well as more inherent buffing within their own kit, something like Rochia's attack buff. But, as we all know at this point, this has not happened, and I still don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. At best, it'll be in a year. So honestly, Xiangli Yao's low damage floor kind of doomed him to become more irrelevant over time, because there really wasn't many ways that you could make sure his performance kept up with the other top dogs. Sure, he got Nightmare Thundering Mephis, and Yinlin got Empyrean Anthem, and these were both very nice buffs that the team very much could appreciate. But remember that this is the same update where we got Carlotta, as well as new Nightmare Echoes for almost every single character in the game. So while Xiangli Yao did see a noticeable increase, so did literally everyone else. And that brings us to Augusta. Augusta, as we now all know, is going to be an Electro main DPS character, and considering the fact that she is the FR of Septimont, and basically Septimont's leader, I don't really see a universe in which Augusta ends up being a mediocre character. WutheringWaves released some new information on Augusta yesterday, and from that information we can see that almost all of her damage counts as heavy attack damage, which means that she already has very good teammate options. Mortefi is one of the best 4-star characters in the entire game. He has a ton of buffs in his kit, a short rotation, and actually also very good personal damage, considering the fact that he is a 4-star. Being a heavy attack DPS also means that Augusta is going to be good with Frolova, giving us a sort of dual carry team in the same way we have Jian and Frolova working together, or Phoebe and Frolova. So Augusta already seems to have multiple team options, one of which being a 4-star. But as you can see, neither of these characters are perfect for Augusta per se. We don't have a Zhezha to Carlotta situation, or a Yinlin to Xiangli Yao situation. Although it is possible that Yuno is going to change this, because, well, they are paired up constantly in the story, they're paired up constantly in marketing, they even have the sun and moon motif. So I think it's going to be extremely silly if these characters don't work together. The one concern that Augusta really has right now is the possibility of her damage output simply not being that high. But there is no doubt in my mind that this is simply not going to be an issue. Every recent DPS has been incredibly powerful. The Mono Fusion team is really powerful, the Mono Havoc team is incredibly powerful, the Cardathea Erosion team is incredibly powerful, Zani is incredibly powerful, Carlotta is still incredibly powerful, DPS Phoebe as well. I don't think there's been a single bad DPS in 2.0. I would even argue that ever since 2.0, there has not been a single dedicated main DPS character that has any sort of major downside that needs to be addressed. So I really doubt we're going to see a situation like with Xiangli Yao where his personal damage is simply lower than other DPSs. But that's just my opinion. What do you think of Electro? Let me know in the comments down below. And while you're down there, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you have any questions, be sure to check the link in the description to join my Discord server. I'm pretty active in there, so there's a pretty good chance to respond. If you just want to see more of me as a person, be sure to check out my second channel, which is also linked in the description. I primarily post Punishing Grey Raven, but I kinda just make videos about whatever I feel like. But that'll be all from me. Peace.